The desert night was quiet, unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that pressed on the ears, broken only by the soft hum of generators and the distant crackle of radios inside the forward operating base. The Navy SEALs stationed there had grown used to that rhythm. Stillness outside, noise within. It was a fragile balance that always preceded chaos. At 0200 hours, the silence cracked. The guard posted at the north watchtower blinked twice, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. In the shimmering haze of the moonlight, something moved across the barren stretch of land between the perimeter and the distant hills. A shadow. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a desert scavenger slipping through the dust. But the shadow staggered, then rose, then staggered again. Movement, the guard whispered into his radio, his voice tight. North sector. Lone figure. Closing in. Immediately, floodlights snapped on, casting beams of harsh white across the sand. Rifles were raised, fingers brushing triggers. The men inside the base froze in their routines, knowing that nothing good ever walked straight into a military outpost unannounced. The desert rarely delivered gifts, it delivered threats. The figure kept coming. At 200 yards, they could see it was human. At 100, they saw it was a woman. She stumbled, her body jerking as though each step might be her last. Her clothing was shredded, a tattered uniform that bore no insignia. Blood smeared her arms, her face, her side. Dust clung to her like a second skin. She didn't raise her hands, didn't wave a flag, didn't shout for help. She just kept moving forward, relentless, as though driven by some force stronger than pain. The SEALs exchanged uneasy glances. Civilians did not wander into war zones like this. And even if she were one, no untrained civilian could have survived walking miles through open desert at night, past enemy patrols and mine-laced terrain. Yet here she was, alone. At 50 yards, her legs gave out. She fell hard to her knees, catching herself on trembling hands. For a moment, it seemed she would collapse entirely. The guard shouted for her to stop where she was, but she didn't answer. She lifted her head, meeting the floodlights, her eyes narrowed against the glare. They were sharp, piercing, filled with a defiance that silenced the men aiming rifles at her. Then she pushed herself upright again. One step, another, and another. It was less walking and more dragging herself forward. Every ounce of strength poured into closing the last few yards. By the time she reached the outer wire, her body swayed violently, her breath ragged. She grasped at the barrier with bloodied fingers, clutching the metal as if it were the only thing holding her upright. "Open the gate," someone muttered, though no one moved. Commander Harris stepped out from the shadows then, drawn by the commotion. A tall, broad-shouldered man with years of battle etched into his face, he didn't waste words. He simply studied her as she stood there, barely alive but refusing to fall. He saw what the others hadn't yet noticed. This wasn't desperation in her eyes. It was resolve. "Gate," Harris ordered. The soldiers obeyed. The moment the barrier opened, the woman stumbled through. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the dirt inside the base. Instinct kicked in. Two medics rushed forward, lifting her carefully. She tried to shrug them off, but her strength finally gave out. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering shut. "Get her to the medical tent," Harris said, his voice clipped. They carried her quickly, the SEALs parting to let them pass. But every pair of eyes followed her, their faces unreadable. They were men trained to kill without hesitation, hardened against fear and pain. Yet none of them had seen anything quite like this, a woman appearing from nowhere, torn to pieces, and still fighting to stand tall. Inside the medical tent, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the sharp tongue of blood. The medics laid her on a cot, their hands working fast to assess her wounds. Lacerations across her ribs, a deep gash on her thigh, bruises blooming like shadows across her body. She should have been unconscious long ago, but even as the medics pressed gauze to her side, her hand shot up, gripping one man's wrist with surprising strength. "No drugs," she rasped, her voice cracked but firm. The medics glanced at Harris, uncertain. He gave a curt nod. "Do as she says." They worked silently, stitching without morphine, cleaning without anesthetic. Every time the needle bit into her skin, she winced, but she didn't cry out. She bit down on the inside of her cheek, her jaw locked tight. The SEALs stood at the edges of the tent, watching. Some whispered under their breath, unable to contain their curiosity. Who was she? How had she survived out there? Where had she come from? Their voices rose and fell, a low hum of suspicion and disbelief. But Commander Harris said nothing. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked open once, landing on him. For the briefest moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a warning, perhaps even a challenge. And then her gaze shifted away, back to the canvas ceiling above. When the medics finished, she sat up slowly, her face pale but determined. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, ignoring their protests. Her body trembled violently, but she refused to stay down. The SEALs exchanged another round of glances. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. She was wounded, barely standing, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength they had only seen in each other. Those who had bled in silence, who had endured without recognition. And none of them could explain why, but in that moment, the air inside the tent shifted. They had all felt it. She didn't just survive her arrival. She owned it. The medical tent smelled of blood, sweat, and antiseptic, a sharp, metallic odor that clung to the air. Fluorescent lamps hummed overhead, their pale glow casting stark shadows across the canvas walls. Outside, the desert wind pushed against the tent flaps, rattling them like impatient fingers tapping on glass. Inside, the SEALs gathered along the edges, silent observers. They had seen wounded men before, comrades brought back broken, sometimes lifeless. But this was different. This wasn't one of their own. This was a stranger, a woman. And the way she carried herself unsettled them more than any wound ever could. She sat on the cot, back straight despite her bandaged ribs, eyes fixed on something unseen. Her hands rested on her thighs, the knuckles white, as though she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. She had refused morphine, refused to lie down, refused to close her eyes for longer than a blink. Her silence pressed against the men around her, heavy, suffocating. One SEAL leaned toward another, voice low. She shouldn't even be alive. She walked through open desert, at night, with those wounds. The other muttered back. Hell, I wouldn't bet on half of us making it. Maybe she's local. Civilian caught in the crossfire. Civilians don't strip down an M4 like it's a puzzle toy. There, whispers weren't meant for her ears, but she heard every word. Her eyes flicked toward them, sharp and unblinking. The murmurs died instantly. Commander Harris stood with arms folded at the far end of the tent, studying her. He had seen men break in interrogation rooms, watched soldiers beg for mercy when pain carved too deep. But this woman, this bleeding, battered stranger, didn't flinch. Even as the medics worked on her, needles biting into torn flesh, she had kept her jaw locked, her gaze steady. He noticed something else too, the rhythm of her breathing. Controlled, disciplined, like a soldier forcing her body to obey, no matter how badly it wanted to collapse. Vitals are stable, one medic reported quietly. She's lost a lot of blood, but she'll hold for now. Harris nodded, but kept his eyes on her. Name? The medic hesitated. She hasn't said a word. The commander stepped closer, boots grinding softly on the dirt floor. He crouched down in front of her, lowering himself to eye level. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Her skin was pale under the harsh lights, her lips cracked, dried with dust. But her eyes, they were alive. Too alive. "Who are you?" Harris asked, his voice low, measured. She didn't answer. "Where did you come from?" Still silence. Behind him, one of the younger SEALs shifted impatiently. "Maybe she doesn't speak English." At that, her eyes flicked to the soldier, holding him in place like a pinned insect. Slowly, deliberately, she spoke. "I understand you." Her voice was hoarse, raw from dehydration and blood loss, but firm. It silenced the tent more effectively than a gunshot. Harris tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Then answer the question." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She lowered her gaze, staring at her hands. The silence returned, thicker than before. The commander didn't push further. He didn't need to. He had seen this before. Men and women who carried secrets locked so deep that words became dangerous. She wasn't refusing out of defiance. She was refusing out of necessity. He rose to his full height. "She stays here? No one touches her, no one questions her until I say so." "Yes, sir," the medics replied in unison. But the SEALs weren't satisfied. They weren't used to mysteries inside their perimeter. One of them, tall and broad with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Commander, with respect, we don't know who she is. She could be compromised. She could be—" The woman's head snapped up. Her eyes locked on him, icy and unblinking. She didn't speak, didn't move, but something in her stare stopped him mid-sentence. He swallowed hard, stepping back into line. Harris noticed it too. That look, it wasn't fear. It wasn't rage. It was recognition, as if she had seen men like him before, many times, and already measured them. The commander dismissed the men with a nod. One by one, they filed out of the tent, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders. The whispers resumed outside, circling like vultures. Inside, quiet returned. The woman sat still, her breathing shallow but steady. Harris lingered at the entrance, watching her one last time before stepping out into the night. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing faintly in the dark. "She's not just some stray," he muttered to himself. The desert wind carried his words away, but the truth lingered. He had seen enough to know. This woman was more than what she appeared. And whatever her past was, it was about to change everything. The next day, the camp woke to find her still seated on the cot, as if she hadn't moved all night. Her bandages were stained, but she hadn't asked for help. A tray of untouched rations sat by her side. When a young SEAL offered water, she accepted it with a curt nod, sipping slowly. Her silence unnerved him. He left quickly. By noon, the men were restless. They had missions to prepare for, but their minds kept drifting back to her. Who was she? What was she hiding? Why had Commander Harris protected her without explanation? In the heat of the day, the whispers grew bolder. CIA, one said. Mercenary, another guessed. Looks like Black Ops scars to me. They were wrong on every count, but none of them knew it yet. The woman heard every word, but she didn't flinch. She let them talk. She had survived worse than suspicion. Her silence was her armor. Her eyes were her weapon. And soon, they would all learn just how sharp both could be. The desert sun blazed down mercilessly, baking the base in a haze of heat. By mid-afternoon, the forward operating base was alive with the rhythm of routine, drills, maintenance, briefings. Yet beneath the surface, nothing felt routine. A woman in the medical tent had thrown the entire camp off balance. Whispers followed her everywhere. Even without words, she was present in every conversation. Men speculated in hushed tones, trying to piece together her story like a classified puzzle they weren't cleared to solve. "Look at the way she sits," one seal muttered as he passed the tent. "Back straight, eyes always scanning. That's no civilian, yeah? Then why is she here alone? Maybe she deserted. Maybe she's bait." Theories piled up, each more outrageous than the last. But none of them could deny what they had seen. She should have been dead, yet she wasn't. Commander Harris kept his thoughts to himself. He had known soldiers who carried their pasts like invisible scars, and he recognized that look in her eyes. It wasn't just survival, it was experience. The kind you didn't earn without walking through fire. By late afternoon, Harris stepped into the tent again. She was exactly where he had left her, sitting on the cot, her shoulders squared, despite the bandages tight across her ribs. "You haven't eaten," Harris observed, nodding toward the untouched tray. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. "Food slows you down when you're bleeding." The answer was so quick, so matter-of-fact, that Harris felt the corner of his mouth twitch. She wasn't just surviving, she was still operating under discipline. Before he could reply, the flap of the tent opened, and two younger SEALs entered, their energy loud in contrast to her silence. One carried an M4 carbine, freshly cleaned and gleaming in the dim light. "Commander," the taller one said, trying to sound casual. "Thought we'd test a theory." Harris raised a brow. "A theory?" The soldier smirked. "If she's what some of the guys think she is, then she knows her way around more than just walking through desert. If not," he let the sentence hang, leaving the implication clear. Harris didn't stop them. He wanted to see what she would do. The younger SEAL set the weapon on the table beside her cot. "Here, field strip it, reassemble. Let's see what you've got." For a moment, the woman didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the weapon, expression unreadable. The younger SEALs shifted, exchanging glances. One smirked as if he had already proven his point. Then, without a word, she reached for the rifle. Her hands were trembling from blood loss, but her movements were sure. In one swift motion, she pulled the charging handle, checked the chamber, and began disassembling with practiced ease. The clatter of metal filled the tent. Bolt carrier, firing pin, buffer spring. Each part came apart with crisp efficiency. The watching SEALs leaned in, their smirks fading. Her breathing grew heavier, sweat beading on her forehead, but she didn't stop. Her fingers danced over the weapon, stripping it bare piece by piece. Then, just as swiftly, she began reassembling. Click, snap, lock. Every sound was precise, confident. When she slid the last pin into place, she pulled the charging handle, snapped the forward assist, and slammed the rifle down on the table with a sharp finality. The entire process had taken less than 2 minutes. The tent was silent. The younger SEAL who had challenged her shifted awkwardly, his jaw tight. The smirk was gone, replaced by something else. Grudging respect, maybe even unease. She leaned back on the cot, her face pale from the effort. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath ragged, but her eyes never wavered. She looked at them with a quiet defiance, as though daring them to doubt her again. "Fastest I've seen," one medic muttered under his breath. The woman's gaze snapped toward him, and he went quiet instantly. Commander Harris stepped forward, studying the rifle, then her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Where do you think?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. She hadn't given an answer. She had given a challenge. Harris felt the eyes of his men on him, waiting for his reaction. But he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he nodded once. "Good enough?" The younger SEALs shifted uncomfortably. One opened his mouth to argue, but Harris silenced him with a look. The woman reached for the rifle again, resting it across her lap. Her hands shook as she smoothed her palm over the metal, but the way she held it, not like a burden, but like an extension of herself, left no doubt. She didn't just know weapons. She belonged to them. For the first time since her arrival, the camp wasn't buzzing with suspicion. Now it buzzed with something else, a growing respect, tinged with unease. Because whatever she wasn't just a survivor. She was a soldier, and she had just proven it beyond question. That night, as darkness settled over the base, the men gathered in the mess hall, their voices hushed but urgent. "You saw her. She's trained." "Trained?" "She stripped and rebuilt that M4 faster than I could on my best day. Still doesn't explain how she ended up here. She's something, all right. But she's not telling." Their words carried the weight of men grappling with the unknown. They had been taught to categorize everything, friend or foe, ally or enemy. But she didn't fit neatly into either box. She was something else entirely. And that unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. Back in the medical tent, she sat alone, the rifle still resting across her knees. Her head tilted slightly as she listened to the distant murmurs. She didn't need to hear every word to know what they were saying. She had lived long enough among men like this to predict their doubts, their suspicions, their fears. It didn't bother her. She wasn't here to earn their trust. But if they pushed her, she would take it anyway. Commander Harris stood outside the tent, smoking in the shadows. He had watched the entire scene, the way she had silenced his men without speaking a word. He exhaled slowly, the ember of his cigarette glowing in the dark. "She's not just a soldier," he muttered under his breath. "She's something more," and though he didn't say it aloud, he knew the truth. Whatever her past was, it was about to collide with theirs. And nothing in the desert would ever be the same. Night in the desert always came suddenly, like a curtain dropping on a stage. One moment the camp was baking under the brutal sun, and the next it was swallowed by darkness, the air sharp and cool. The base came alive under floodlights, their harsh beams cutting long shadows across the dirt. Radios crackled, boots pounded on gravel, and engines roared as the SEALs prepared gear for the next day. But beneath that rhythm, something unspoken lingered. The woman. She hadn't moved much from the cot, though her posture never slackened. Even wounded, she sat straight, her chin raised, her gaze steady. The rifle she had reassembled rested within reach, as though it had always been hers. And because of her, the base was no longer the same. The whispers started small, traded between two men on watch, then carried into the mess hall, then whispered again at the armory. By midnight, every soldier had heard at least one version of the story. "She's CIA. Has to be. Nobody else could survive out there. Not CIA. Heard about the scars? That's Special Forces work. She's Black Ops for sure. No, she's a deserter. That's why she won't talk. She's bait. They planted her here, waiting to break us from the inside." Theories spun in circles, each more outrageous than the last, but none of them eased the tension. Because beneath all the speculation, one fact remained: she wasn't ordinary. And the men who had mocked her before were now quieter, their voices tinged with unease. The woman ignored it all. She didn't flinch when the whispers reached her. She didn't react when men passed by the medical tent with suspicious stares. She simply sat, her silence like a wall no one could climb. But Commander Harris saw more than silence. He lingered at the edges of the tent that night, his silhouette framed by the glow of his cigarette. Smoke curled around him as he watched her through the thin canvas. He had seen enough in his years to know when a soldier wasn't just surviving, but hiding. And she was hiding more than wounds. She was hiding history. A medic approached him quietly, hesitant to interrupt. "Sir, she should be resting. She refuses to lie down. I don't think she trusts us." Harris exhaled, the ember of his cigarette glowing red in the dark. "Would you?" The medic swallowed hard and didn't answer. Inside, the woman's eyes flicked toward the shadow of Harris outside the tent. She knew he was watching. She could feel it. For a moment, she let her mask slip, her shoulders sagging, her hand brushing the scar that cut across her ribs. Memories threatened to surface, faces, voices, the stench of burning fuel, the sound of gunfire too close. She forced it back down, straightening again. She had survived too long to let her past show now. But the past never stayed buried forever. The next morning, the rumors intensified. Over breakfast, the SEALs spoke louder, emboldened by the cover of the mess hall. "I heard the commander's protecting her," one soldier said, stabbing at his rations. "Protecting her? He doesn't protect anyone. He throws us in headfirst and tells us to swim." "Exactly. That's why it's strange. He knows something. He's seen her before." The table went quiet. That thought, that Harris himself might recognize her, was more unsettling than any rumor. Because if their commander, a man who'd seen and done everything, treated her like someone worth protecting, then she wasn't just dangerous. She was important. At another table, a younger SEAL leaned closer to his teammates. "You remember those stories about Task Force Viper? Ghost missions, denied on paper? My uncle swore they were real. Maybe she's one of them." "Task Force Viper's a fairy tale," another scoffed. "Scare stories to keep rookies sharp. Then explain her." The man fell silent. No one could. Later that afternoon, Harris called a briefing. The men gathered in the operations tent, maps spread across tables, radios hissing with static. The commander stood at the front, his presence commanding without effort. But even as he outlined the mission parameters, the men's eyes drifted toward the medical tent nearby. They couldn't focus. Not fully. Harris noticed. He slammed his fist onto the table, making them jump. "Eyes forward," he barked. "You'll know what I want you to know, when I want you to know it. Until then, focus." The men straightened, but the unease didn't leave their faces. When the briefing ended, Harris lingered behind, staring down at the maps. He traced a finger along the terrain, but his mind wasn't on the mission. It was on her. He remembered her file. Years ago. Redacted lines, black bars across entire pages. A photograph? Blurry, grainy, but enough to burn into memory. A woman who wasn't supposed to exist. A soldier who fought where even SEALs weren't allowed to tread. Most men would have dismissed it as rumor. But Harris had seen too much to doubt. And now she was sitting in his camp, wounded, silent, and alive. That night, the desert wind howled, rattling the perimeter wire. Harris found himself walking the base, boots crunching in the gravel, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. He passed the barracks, the armory, the vehicles lined in neat rows. Everything was as it should be. Except it wasn't. He stopped outside the medical tent again. Inside, she sat awake, her eyes open in the dim light, as though she had been waiting for him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other through the thin canvas wall. Then, finally, Harris spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "You can stay silent as long as you want, but they'll find out soon enough. Ghosts don't stay buried forever." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was confirmation enough. And as Harris turned away, he knew the truth. The storm her past would bring hadn't even begun. In the days that followed, the camp felt different. The men went about their drills, but their conversations circled the same point. Her. They trained harder, shot longer, ran faster, as though proving themselves against an invisible standard she had set. But at night, when the camp quieted and the desert stretched endlessly under the stars, each man found himself thinking the same thing. Who was she? And why did the commander look at her like he already knew the answer? The operations tent buzzed with the low hum of restless men. Maps were pinned to corkboards, laptops glowed with satellite feeds, and the smell of stale coffee mixed with sweat. Yet for all the noise, the atmosphere was taut, stretched like a wire ready to snap. The SEALs were disciplined. They had been trained to compartmentalize, to lock away distraction and focus on mission above all else. But in the past few days, that discipline had frayed. No matter how hard they tried, their eyes drifted toward the medical tent, toward her. Every whispered rumor, every sidelong glance had piled into a weight that pressed on the entire camp. And Harris felt it. He could see it in the men's faces. Their focus was cracked, and in combat, cracks killed. Tonight, he would fix it. "Sit down," Harris ordered, stepping into the tent. His voice carried the authority of a man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. The men gathered around the briefing table, folding chairs creaking under their weight. They looked at him expectantly, though their minds were already elsewhere. Harris lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating the lines carved into his face. He exhaled slowly, letting the smoke curl upward. Then he looked at his men, one by one. "I know what you're all thinking," he said flatly. "You want to know who she is, where she came from, why I let her stay." A ripple of unease moved through the group. Some shifted in their seats, others straightened, as though bracing themselves. Harris dropped the cigarette into a tin tray and crushed it out. His eyes hardened. "She's not a civilian. She's not CIA. She's not bait." The words fell heavy into the room. One of the younger SEALs leaned forward. "Then what is she, sir?" For a long moment, Harris said nothing. He clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly along the edge of the table. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Then finally, he stopped. "She was Task Force Viper." The room froze. The words hit harder than a grenade. Every man present had heard the name whispered at least once. It was the kind of rumor you dismissed in daylight, but remembered in the dark. A phantom unit. A ghost story. Missions so black, they didn't exist on paper. Soldiers so buried in secrecy, they were practically myths. The younger SEALs looked confused, glancing at each other. But the older ones, the veterans who had been in long enough to know the whispers, stiffened. Their jaws tightened. Their eyes sharpened. Because they knew what that meant. One finally spoke, his voice low. "Sir, Viper doesn't exist." Harris fixed him with a hard stare. "That's what they want you to believe." The room shifted. A chair scraped. No one spoke. "She was there," Harris continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "She went where we weren't allowed to go. Missions scrubbed from records before they were even finished. You think we've seen war? You think we've seen sacrifice? She's been walking through hell longer than some of you have been shaving." The words silenced even the cockiest among them. Harris let it settle before continuing. "You saw her strip and rebuild that M4 with half her blood on the floor. You saw the scars on her body. That's not random. That's years of fighting battles no one will ever admit happened. That's Task Force Viper." One SEAL muttered under his breath, disbelief bleeding through. "But why here? Why now?" "She's alive," Harris said simply. And that's more than most of our unit can say. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Every man in the room had stormed compounds, dragged brothers out under fire, stared death in the face. But this was different. This was the realization that someone had walked darker roads than even they had dared. For the first time, they weren't the apex predators in the room. They were in the presence of something else. Respect. That's what settled in now. Not the kind earned by rank or medals, but the kind carved by survival, by scars, by legends whispered in the shadows. Harris leaned forward, his voice low, steady. So the next time you think about questioning her, remember this. She's already survived missions that would have buried every single one of you. She doesn't need your approval. She doesn't need your trust. But she has mine. That's enough, no one argued. No one even breathed too loud. The commander's words hung in the air, final and immovable. When the briefing ended, the men filed out in silence. Their usual swagger was gone, replaced by something heavier. They avoided each other's eyes, each man lost in thought. The whispers that had filled the camp for days had been strangled in a single moment. Outside, the desert stretched under the moonlight, endless and unforgiving. The men walked past the medical tent, their gazes lingering, but no longer mocking, no longer suspicious. Now, there was only quiet recognition. Inside, the woman sat as she always did, upright, silent, watchful. She didn't know what Harris had told them, but she could feel the difference. When the men passed, their eyes carried something new. Not pity, not suspicion. Something deeper. Respect. She didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. Because she hadn't come here to earn their respect. She had come here to survive. Still, as the night deepened and the camp settled, she allowed herself one small breath of relief. For the first time since she staggered through those gates, the whispers had stopped. For now, but Commander Harris knew the silence wouldn't last. He sat alone in his quarters, staring at the single folder locked in his desk drawer. The one with her blurred photo, the one stamped with so many redacted lines, it was barely legible. Task Force Viper, the kind of file that burned holes in your conscience just for reading it. He poured a glass of whiskey, the liquid catching the dim light. He raised it to his lips, but didn't drink. Instead, he whispered to the empty room. You should have stayed buried. Because legends, no matter how respected, always brought trouble back with them. And trouble had just walked through his gate. The desert sun rose mercilessly, burning the camp in golden fire. By morning, the whispers had vanished. The SEALs didn't talk about her anymore, not in the open, not even in hushed tones. Commander Harris's words had sealed their lips. But silence didn't mean peace. The men glanced at her differently now. When they passed by the medical tent, their eyes lingered, not in suspicion, but in something closer to awe. They carried themselves a little straighter, trained a little harder, as though her mere presence raised the invisible bar of excellence. Yet beneath the respect lay something else. Unease. Legends didn't belong in the real world. Legends meant ghosts, and ghosts carried shadows with them. By the third day, she insisted on leaving the cot. The medics argued, but she ignored them, pushing herself up with deliberate calm. Her movements were slow, but unyielding. As though pain was just another enemy she refused to acknowledge. The first time she stepped outside, the camp froze. Men stopped mid-step. Conversations died. The metallic clang of tools stilled. All eyes turned toward the scarred figure who walked as though she had never been broken. She didn't look at them, didn't seek approval. She simply made her way toward the armory, her steps steady, her expression unreadable. Inside, she requested gear. The quartermaster hesitated. Ma'am, I'm not sure. Her gaze cut him off sharper than a blade. Moments later, she walked out with a sidearm, 2 magazines, and a combat knife strapped to her thigh. The sight shifted something in the air. It wasn't a patient recovering anymore. It was a soldier preparing. The SEALs trained daily. Weapons drills, endurance runs, close quarters sparring. That afternoon, She appeared at the training ground, standing at the edge, watching. The men felt her eyes on them and pushed harder, faster, sharper. Sweat poured, muscles strained, lungs burned. But none dared slack while she observed. Finally, one Ecal Ramirez, cocky, broad-shouldered, broke from the group. He wiped sweat from his forehead and approached her. "You just gonna stand there, ghost? Or you gonna show us why the commander thinks you're worth the silence?" A murmur ran through the men. Some smirked, eager to see the confrontation, while others frowned, sensing danger. She studied Ramirez for a long moment. Then, without a word, she stepped onto the sparring mat. The crowd tightened around them. Ramirez grinned. "All right then. Show us." What followed lasted less than 10 seconds. He lunged. She sidestepped, her movements fluid, efficient. His punch met empty air. She caught his arm, twisted, and sent him crashing to the ground with a thud that rattled the mat. Before he could recover, her knife was at his throat, not drawn from her belt, but slipped free during the throw so quickly no one saw it. The camp went silent. She stepped back, sliding the blade into its sheath as Ramirez groaned on the mat. She didn't gloat, didn't taunt. She simply walked off the mat, her expression as calm as when she'd entered. Respect had been one thing. Fear was another. Now she had both. That night, the mess hall was quiet. The usual banter, jokes, and arguments had dulled. Instead, the men ate in silence, sneaking glances at her where she sat alone at the far table. Finally, one SEAL broke the quiet. "She's not just Task Force Viper," he muttered. "She's something else." Another shook his head. "Doesn't matter. She fights like that. She's one of us." But a third leaned in, voice low. "Or she's a reminder of what will never be." The words sank heavy into the table. She didn't hear them, but she didn't need to. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the way soldiers measured themselves against her. Some admired, some resented, all were unsettled. Commander Harris observed quietly. He didn't interfere, didn't guide the men toward acceptance or rejection. He let the dynamic evolve on its own, knowing soldiers forged bonds not through orders, but through fire. Still, he saw the danger. The balance was fragile. That balance broke the next day. The mission was routine, a reconnaissance sweep of abandoned compounds on the edge of hostile territory. 4 vehicles, 12 men. Low risk, high boredom. She wasn't on the roster. Harris hadn't approved it. But when the convoy rolled out, she was in the lead Humvee, sitting silently in the back seat, gear strapped tight. The men didn't argue. They didn't dare. 2 hours into the desert, the convoy slowed. The compound loomed ahead, a cluster of ruined buildings half buried in sand. It was quiet. Too quiet. The SEALs spread out, weapons raised, moving in practiced formations. Dust crunched beneath their boots as they swept room after room. Nothing. Empty. Then a click. An IED. The lead man froze, sweat dripping as the faint beep echoed beneath the floorboard. Panic surged through the squad. They had seconds, maybe less. Before anyone could react, she was there. She shoved the man back, dropped to the floor, and in a blur of motion disarmed the device. Wires clipped, timer dead, silence restored. The men stared, hearts pounding. She stood, dust on her hands, calm, as if she had just closed a book. Without a word, she walked past them, deeper into the compound. And in that moment, something shifted permanently. Not fear, not awe, trust, the kind forged only when a soldier proves they're willing to stand between you and death. That night, when the convoy returned, the camp felt different. For the first time, she wasn't sitting alone in the mess hall. A tray slid onto the table across from her. Then another. Soon, the entire squad was seated around her, eating in silence. No jokes, no questions, no whispers. Just presence. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But for the first time since arriving, she wasn't alone. In his quarters, Harris watched through the window, the faint glow of the mess hall flickering in the distance. He sipped his whiskey slowly, his jaw tight. She was becoming one of them. Not because she sought it, but because she had earned it. And Harris knew that was both her greatest strength and the camp's greatest risk. Because ghosts never stayed in the shadows forever. The desert had a way of stripping men down to their bones. It took patience, pride, and even fear, leaving only what was real. Over the last week, the SEALs had seen the woman stripped bare of everything except survival. And survival, they were learning, was a language they understood all too well. It started with small gestures. A canteen passed across the table. A seat left open in the Humvee. A glance shared during patrol, not suspicious, but acknowledging. No one spoke about it, but the silence between them changed. It was no longer heavy with doubt. It carried something else now, respect, almost kinship. For soldiers, words mattered less than action, and her actions had been louder than anyone's voice. One evening, after a long patrol, Ramirez, the same man she had dropped on the sparring mat, approached her near the armory. He scratched the back of his neck, awkward, the cocky grin gone. "Hey," he muttered. "I was out of line before. Thought you were a story. Turns out you're the story." She didn't answer. Ramirez chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, figured you wouldn't talk. Just glad you're here. You got our backs. That's all that matters." He walked off before she could reply, though she hadn't intended to. Still, for the first time in years, she felt a faint warmth stir inside her chest. Not trust. Not yet. But something close. That night, though, the warmth burned away. Sleep never came easy. Not for her. And when it did, it came with ghosts. The nightmare gripped her like a vice. Fire, choking smoke, the roar of gunfire, bodies dragging through sand. Her brothers in arms screaming her name. Not the name the SEALs knew her by, but another one, long buried. She remembered the sound of their breaths as they fell, the silence afterward louder than any explosion. Her hands clawed the cot, sweat pouring down her skin. A strangled cry tore from her throat before she forced it back down, biting hard into her lip until the taste of blood snapped her awake. She sat upright, trembling, her chest heaving. The camp was quiet, but not silent. A few voices outside, boots crunching gravel, the faint hum of generators. She swallowed hard, wiping sweat from her brow. And then she realized someone had heard. A shadow lingered at the entrance of the medical tent. Not Harris. Not a medic. One of the SEALs, young, wide-eyed, clearly uncertain whether to step in. She locked eyes with him. Neither spoke. Finally, he gave a stiff nod, almost an apology, and walked away. The nightmare stayed with her long after he left. The next morning, the squad gathered for weapons maintenance. She sat among them now, her hands working on an M4 with the same precision she had shown the day Harris found her. "Hey," one of the men said suddenly, tilting his head toward her scars. "That one there. Looks like shrapnel." She didn't answer. Another leaned forward, gesturing toward the long line across her ribs. "Eyed or a blade?" Silence. Finally, Ramirez spoke, his tone sharp. "Enough. She doesn't owe you answers." The men quieted, chastised. But their eyes lingered on her, curious. She felt their stares like weights pressing on her skin. And for the first time, she wondered if silence was enough. That evening, Commander Harris called her to his quarters. She entered without hesitation, standing rigid as his eyes studied her. "You've integrated faster than I expected," he said. She didn't respond. Harris poured whiskey into a glass, but didn't drink. "The men are starting to trust you." "That's good. But it comes with questions. They'll want to know more. And sooner or later, you'll slip." Her eyes narrowed. "You've survived longer than most ghosts," Harris continued, his voice steady. "But ghosts always leave traces. The nightmares, the scars, the names you mutter in your sleep. They'll hear them. And when they do, silence won't protect you anymore." She stiffened, her jaw tight. Harris leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "I'm not asking you to tell them everything. But if you want to stay in their circle, you'll have to give them something. Even a shadow of the truth." For a long moment, the room was thick with unspoken words. Then she turned and left, her silence as heavy as ever. The next mission came 2 days later. Another compound sweep, but this one wasn't empty. Gunfire erupted the moment they breached. Bullets tore through walls, dust exploding into clouds. The SEALs moved as one, their training flawless. But even flawless plans bent under chaos. Ramirez went down first, pinned behind rubble as rounds peppered the ground inches from his helmet. She didn't hesitate. Moving with terrifying speed, she darted into the line of fire, her sidearm barking 3 precise shots. Each found its mark. She dragged Ramirez back into cover, blood streaking her arm where a round had grazed her. "Stay down," she barked, the first words some of them had ever heard from her. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The insurgents fell, silence returning to the ruined compound. But it wasn't victory the SEALs felt as they regrouped. It was revelation. She had spoken. Not much, but enough. Enough to remind them she wasn't mute. She had chosen silence. And that choice made them wonder, what else was she choosing to hide? Back at camp, as the medics tended Ramirez's minor wounds, the SEALs sat around her in a loose circle. No one spoke at first. Finally, one of the younger men cleared his throat. "You saved his life," she shrugged. "So would you." The simple response stunned them more than any silence had. Her voice was low, rough, but steady. A soldier's voice. Another leaned forward. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Her eyes flicked up, cold and sharp. "Same place you did. Somewhere we weren't supposed to be." The men exchanged looks. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. A crack in the wall. And for soldiers living in the shadow of war, sometimes a crack was enough to let the light in. Later that night, alone in her tent, she replayed the firefight in her mind. The blood, the chaos, the way the SEALs had looked at her afterward. Not with suspicion, not even with fear, but with a strange mixture of respect and hunger. Hunger for answers. She touched the scar across her ribs and closed her eyes. Harris was right. Silence couldn't hold forever. The ghosts of her past weren't content to stay buried. They were clawing their way back into the light. And soon she would have to decide, speak the truth or let the silence break her. The desert at dawn looked almost peaceful, the horizon painted in strokes of gold and red. But peace never lasted here. The convoy had been ambushed 3 miles out, not by scattered insurgents this time, but by something far more coordinated. RPGs shrieked across the sand, gunfire tore into the air, and the SEALs found themselves pinned. The vehicles burned, smoke choking the sky. Chaos reigned. Commander Harris barked orders, rallying his men into cover. Bullets shredded stone and metal alike, the air alive with violence. And then she moved. Not recklessly, not with hesitation, with purpose. While the SEALs hunkered down, trading fire, She slipped into the storm like it was her element. She darted between ruins, her body low and fluid, returning fire with precision so cold it unsettled even hardened soldiers. Every shot found its target. Every motion was instinct, carved from years of surviving where no one else had. When an RPG team appeared on the ridge, Harris shouted for suppression fire. Before the words left his mouth, she was already climbing the crumbled wall, knife in hand. The SEALs watched, stunned, as she dismantled the enemy position alone, moving with terrifying efficiency. Minutes later, the gunfire dwindled. The insurgents scattered. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of burning vehicles. The SEALs regrouped, catching their breath, their eyes fixed on her. Blood streaked her face, not all of it hers. Her knife dripped as she wiped it on her vest. No one spoke. Finally, Ramirez broke the silence. His voice was hoarse. "What the hell are you?" The question hung in the smoke-filled air. She looked at him, at all of them. For the first time since arriving at the camp, her mask cracked. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with something between fury and grief. And then, slowly, she spoke. "I was Task Force Viper." Her voice carried over the wreckage, steady but raw. The men stiffened. They had heard Harris say it before, but hearing it from her, from the ghost herself, made it real. "We weren't supposed to exist," she continued. "Not on paper. Not in whispers. We were the ones they sent when missions couldn't be acknowledged. The ones they denied before they even happened." Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, as though she could still see the past painted across the desert. There were 12 of us. 12 shadows. We went where even SEALs weren't cleared to go. We did what no one else would do. And every mission ended the same: silence. No medals, no names. Just another line erased from the world. The SEALs listened, transfixed. She touched the scar across her ribs. We thought we were untouchable. We weren't. One night, everything went wrong. We walked into a trap. Half my team was dead in the first minute. The rest. They fought until there was nothing left to fight with. I crawled out with nothing but scars and ghosts. Her voice faltered, just once. I was the last. The only one left a Viper. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crackle of burning wreckage seemed distant. She looked back at them, her gaze sharp. "That's why I don't talk. That's why I don't trust. Because I buried my family in places no one will ever admit existed. And I've been running from their ghosts ever since." Ramirez swallowed hard, his usual bravado stripped away. "So why here? Why us?" Her eyes softened, just slightly. "I didn't choose here. I didn't choose you. I chose to survive. That's all I've ever done." Another SEAL spoke, his voice low. "You're more than survival. You're a reminder." She tilted her head. He continued, "That even the best of us, we're just soldiers. You? You're proof of what happens when the war takes everything and still demands more." The men nodded, their expressions heavy with understanding. Respect wasn't the word anymore. Reverence, maybe. Or something deeper. Commander Harris stepped forward, his voice cutting through the moment. "You've heard it from her now. You know what she is. And you know what she's survived. So remember this. She's not here to haunt us. She's here to fight beside us. And if any of you can't accept that, pack your gear and walk." Not one man moved. The return to camp was quiet. No questions, no whispers. The SEALs carried themselves differently now. Not like men weighed down by fear or suspicion, but like soldiers standing beside a legend who had chosen, against all odds, to keep fighting. That night, for the first time, she didn't sit alone in the mess hall. She sat among them, sharing their food, their silence, their presence. It wasn't camaraderie yet, not fully, but it was something stronger than she had allowed herself in years. When Ramirez raised a toast, his voice steady, the men lifted their cups. To the ghosts who never made it back. And to the one who did. She didn't raise her cup, but she didn't stop them either. For the first time, the silence felt less like a burden and more like peace. Later, when the camp slept, she stood alone outside, staring at the horizon. The wind whipped across the sand, carrying the faint echoes of battles long past. She touched the scars on her skin, the invisible ones deeper still. The ghosts would never leave her. She knew that. But now, for the first time in years, she didn't face them alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In his quarters, Harris poured himself a whiskey, watching her silhouette in the distance. He knew her past would never fully release her. But he also knew this. The SEALs no longer saw her as a burden, or a mystery, or even just a ghost. They saw her as one of them. And that was the greatest silence she had ever broken.